Welcome to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership, where you'll hear insights and useful strategies, as well as lessons learned from other nonprofit leaders and valuable tips from a variety of experts. Here to help you with the challenges and opportunities you face day after day is your host and nonprofit leadership expert, Sarah Olivieri.
Hello, nonprofit leaders, and welcome to your go-to place for information and inspiration to help you be even more effective. I'm your host, Sarah Olivieri, and you're listening to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. My guest for this episode is Maryn, who has over 35 years of a fantastic nonprofit career. Maryn has been an on-staff grant writer, a grants consultant, winning over $42 million for her clients over 10 years, a grants trainer, a grants reviewer, an author, speaker, mentor, and coach, and starting in 2006, even a grant maker. So she has both hats she can share. This 3D background for Maryn brings a unique insider's perspective to the practical, inspiring trainings on healthy, successful grantsmanship she shares with thousands of people each year through her Grants Magic U. A true dual citizen of the grants world, Maryn may be the only person holding membership in both Grant Professionals Association, which is for grant seekers, and Grant Makers for Effective Organizations, which is for grant makers. And in 2020, in recognition of her lifetime contribution to the field, Maryn became just the second inductee into the International Grant Professionals Class of Distinguished Fellows. Welcome, Maryn. It is such a pleasure. Before we dive into our topic, would you just tell us a little bit about yourself personally so our audience can get to know that side of you as well?
Oh my gosh. And thank you so much, Sarah, for inviting me to join you today. There's really nothing I love talking about more than grants and how to navigate grants world more successfully, with the sole exception probably of my grandkids. So I'm kind of excited right now. I live in the Pacific Northwest and we're having a fabulously sunny day. But in a few days, I'm going to be going to Chicago to keynote at the Grant Professional Association conference there, and then taking a little hop from there down to Orlando to visit a granddaughter that has been born since the last time I was there visiting. So
Aw.
it's just from a personal perspective, I love living among the trees of the Pacific Northwest, and I am very much looking forward to seeing grandkids that I haven't seen in a very long while.
I love that. I love that. Well, today, I'm sure we could talk about many things, but today we're going to be
So many.
talking about a concept that you call a total value budget or total value budgeting. So let's just start with, what is it? What's total value budgeting? What's the idea here?
I can't remember when I first came up with the phrase. I'm pretty good at like branding everything I teach from a slightly, off center perspective, but it just is so descriptive because the concept simply says, hey, in nonprofit world particularly, we have been drastically and really tragically understating the total value of everything it takes to do our work in the world by not including the total value of everything it takes to do our work in the world in the budgets specifically that we're presenting to the funding community. So the total value budget concept, and I've got just tons of detail we can share, obviously, simply says when we are building the resource plan for whatever it is we're setting out to do, and that's all a budget is. It's just the resource plan. It's the numbers part of the plan. We need to, I mean, I have a total value pledge, as a matter of fact, that I make my students and my clients take. We need to make the commitment that we will never, ever, 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 ever understate the value of everything it takes to do our work in the world, because what we show the world becomes what the world believes about the nonprofit sector. And it's no
Yeah.
wonder we're in what's called the starvation cycle if we're just simply not showing what it takes to do the work, whether we're asking for grant dollars or donor dollars to support that work or not.
Yeah. I love that. Without thinking about that concept specifically, a number of years ago, I started advising my clients to add kind of a bottom extra line to their budgets where they recorded the amount they were underpaying their staff and then
Ooh,
had like the real expenses if they were paying their staff like a market rate or the
absolutely.
rate they know that they need to be if they don't want to be losing them at rapid rates. And I think I was thinking along the same lines that clearly
Yeah.
you are, that you've got to like show what's really going on here. It's so important.
I love that so much. I have not incorporated that specifically into my total value budget teaching, but the question does come up. And I think to level it up to the next level, we should be showing what our people should be earning if they were being paid fair market rate, because fair market is really the leveler that we use when we're thinking about total value.
All right. So I think we have a concept now of what a total value budget might be. Let's get into a few specifics. So,
Sure.
yeah, tell us a little more like how do you go about doing it? What are some of the biggest issues that people need to be thinking about as they kind of transition to what they have been doing to a total
Mm.
value concept?
I think a good place to really start inside that really big setup is to, I just like to go through, I have four bullet points about why total value matters. And we sort of started alluding to that, but total value is really what reflects what we think of as match or what funders are looking for in terms of match, which can dramatically impact the shape that our budgets take, which can dramatically impact the shape that the grant awards themselves take. It's like the down payment that we're offering, what we're bringing to the table in to leverage the dollars that we're asking the funders to invest in our work, right?
Yeah.
And
So
it
what are some
shows
of
the
those specific like line items or amounts that should be in there when you say that? Can you
well,
give me an
the
example? Mhm.
anything and everything. The biggest ones that, we really address directly because they tend to be the largest dollar value are anything in kind, contributed
Mhm.
services, contributed goods and resources, and contributed services is just another word for quote unquote volunteers. So that entire category of establishing the value of people who are providing their services without being paid for them, in other words, as volunteers.
Yeah.
Anything that comes through from our partners that our partners are providing as part of the recipe, as I like to think of it. But we also don't think about what we are bringing to the table as well, that we're repurposing stuff that we already have, that we are
Mm.
repurposing as the nonprofit. It
Yeah.
has value to the project, it needs to be in the total value budget, right?
Yeah.
And one other factor that often gets overlooked that, it makes accountants get a little squeamish, but we're not talking about an auditable budget, we're talking about showing the total value of everything, is when we get deep discounts for something because we're nonprofits, that counts as contributed value.
Ooh, that's a
So,
really good one.
yeah,
Yeah, I
that's
love
a
that.
good
Yeah, it would
one.
make CPAs and just, kind of a
Yeah,
PSA for everyone out there on budgets. Like I always say like you've got your internal budget that gives you the numbers the way it helps you run your organization better. Then
mhm.
you have a set of budgets for specific projects for funders, specifically certain interested parties. And then you have your version of your budget or your numbers for the IRS. And that's what the
Yeah,
CPA cares about, but the IRS is most interested in making sure that anything that should be taxed is taxed. So they're not interested in the same things you are. And so
right.
what the IRS needs is probably not what you need or the funders need. So by it's very likely you should have multiple versions of your budgets going
And they're
on.
all accurate. It's not like they're
Correct.
in conflict with each other, but they're just looking at your resource plan from different angles for different purposes.
Exactly. So
And yeah, so
I know I digress. So let's get back into, and this is bringing lots of things to mind. So you said,
sure.
like all the resources, the volunteer time, which I know is look
Mhm.
upable, right? You can like look up the value of volunteer hours, I believe, even per
Mhm.
state. It's oh yes, no. Tell
Mm,
me
mm,
more.
mm, mm. Well, tell me what you're thinking about. When you say looking up the value of volunteer hours per state, what are you thinking about
Well, I
specifically,
know
Sarah?
I forget the name of the resource, but there's a website that tracks it every year and creates an estimate for the value of a volunteer hour at nonprofits. I wish I
Let's
could think
talk
of the
about
website.
let us
Tell
talk
me.
about that.
Tell me.
I'm glad you brought that up. Nice segue. Very good. Um, I have been working in volunteer world much longer than I've been working in grants world. So I go way,
Mhm.
way back in volunteer world. And it would drive me crazy in the way back when people were saying things like, oh, they're volunteers, they're not being paid, they shouldn't even be part of the budget plan. So at that time, it was a battle just to get people to think about valuing volunteer time at minimum wage, right?
Mhm.
And then along came the organization you're thinking about, Independent Sector,
That is who
which
I was
is a
thinking about.
nonprofit think tank. And it hasn't been that many years, maybe 10 or 12 years, maybe a little bit longer, when they started coming out every year, right exactly this time of year. I actually went online today to see if they've come out with their 2023, their 2024 numbers for 2023 yet. Last year they came out on April 19th. They're not out yet, but
Okay.
very, very close.
Soon.
And they have come out with what they call the value of volunteer time. It is not the value of volunteer time. I will tell you where that
Tell
number
us.
came from. It's better than minimum wage, which is better than nothing, but it's not the best we've got. The calculations are simply this. It's fairly complicated, actually, but they simply take the compensation for every single job category across all industries and across all sectors, except for managerial jobs and except for
Mhm.
agricultural jobs, and they average them out. So
So
it
it
is
kinda
not
seems low is what it sounds
it
like,
well, it can be. It doesn't
depending
have
on
to
what
be.
they're
It's
doing.
currently $31.80 an hour, which is not necessarily low, not necessarily high. But it changes as the wage levels across the country change. But the point is, the example that I use in my training is if you're one of these wonderful organizations, and I obviously I go all the way to the extreme to make the point. If you're one of these amazing organizations that works with maxillofacial surgeon, these are surgeons who are trained to do facial reconstructive surgery,
Mm.
and they go to developing countries and work with
I'm gonna
kiddos
guess
who are
their
born
time
with
is worth more than $31 an hour.
if you go to my source of information for the fair market value of every single job in every single industry, actual average pay rates for people who get paid to do this because they're trained to do this, maxillofacial surgeons come in at $148.76 an hour,
And
which
that
is
still sounds like
almost
a deal.
it's almost 5 times what you would be setting as the value if you were using the independent sector number.
Yeah,
So again, I picked like really high end, but I'm showing
yeah.
that as an example. If you are understating the value of their time by a factor of 5, if you're not using what they're actually being paid for.
Yeah, and that
So yeah, so that's that point. And yeah, so that's just a great example of what that looks like. So thank you for bringing up the independent sector. They've done a tremendous service to nonprofit
absolutely.
by highlighting the fact that we should be bringing a number here. It's just that the numbers that they use it makes no sense to treat every single person's expertise and
Yeah,
specialty as if it were all the same because we're all lumping it under, oh, volunteers, so it all gets lumped together. It just
yeah.
isn't. So we can
That
do
makes
better
total
than that.
sense.
We can do
Yeah.
better than that. So it's the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which has a very easily look upable way of finding what the prevailing wage rate is for a specific job in a specific industry in any part of the country at all.
So that Bureau of Labor Statistics is where you really
US
wanna
Bureau.
go.
Yeah.
Yeah, and get the real
Yeah.
numbers. I'm all for the real numbers. Let me ask you, what do you think about nonprofits who have like intellectual property or have developed like methods for delivering services? Is that something that could be valued in a budget?
Well, we'll take a little bit of a step back. That's not a question I've specifically considered, but my way of answering that question, if you were my client asking that question, I would say, well, here's the real question we need to be asking first, Sarah. Is that thing you just mentioned necessary for us to actually complete this work successfully? And if it is something that's a necessary resource to complete the work successfully, then it needs to be in the budget. Now, how we establish the value of it, that is the second step. But the first step is it a necessary resource? Do we need to have it in order for the work to be successful? Let's get that yes clear. So I'm not sure. I would like to know a little bit more about what you're thinking about intellectual property.
Well, I often think about, service organizations who are finding new ways of solving problems. So if they have
Okay.
innovated and created something new, either a new technology, maybe they've made a new app, maybe they're therapeutic and they've devised a new therapeutic approach or a specific method for going through how they help people.
Mm.
And maybe they invested a lot in developing that over the years. And now
Mm-hmm.
they're going to bring it to a new program or a new
Mm-hmm.
location. And maybe that's what they're getting funding for. I didn't have an exact use case in mind,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
when I think about, I love nonprofits to be trying to innovate. And,
Mm-hmm.
um, and, and if you're really innovating, you're probably creating new stuff that is adding value to the world that can extend beyond you potentially.
Well, that's an interesting thought, and I think it would be useful to have a use case to look at. It's a tough question to tackle without a specific idea. I'm thinking about having a team that has been specifically trained, perhaps,
Oh,
in a
yeah.
particular therapeutic technique. Well, if they were being fairly compensated for the expertise that they are bringing that's unique and special in the
Yeah,
world, highly specialized experts, what would that compensation level look like? I don't know how easy it would be to backtrack to put a value on the work it took to get them to that point, but,
sure. I
yeah, but
remember
it's a
I was
it's a great
once
question.
I was once in a nonprofit where we were all trained in a specific method called nonviolent crisis intervention.
Mm,
One person with the organization had to go get certified. They'd had a fixed dollar amount, and then she was able to certify all of us. She got to get certified as a teacher, and we all got certifications that cost per person for her to teach us. And our certification was only good as part of that organization. It didn't travel with
mm.
us when we left. So that's a real use case of what you
Yeah.
just mentioned, and that dollar amount would have been very easy to track about how
Excellent,
much it costed,
excellent.
so I love that.
Well, I love that all the times that I've taught this, you've brought a whole new element, and that's what I find happens when we start thinking about total value. People say, "Well, what about this? Well, what about that?" And then we just continue to expand the way we're thinking about
Yeah,
everything. It literally takes it's like when I think about the recipe, it isn't just the ingredients. It isn't just the stuff that goes into the bowl. I always think about chocolate chip cookies for some reason. It's not just the flour and the eggs and the chocolate chips. It's the bowl, it's the mixing spoon, it's the oven, it's the electricity to run the oven, it's the person to
that's
do
right.
the mixing, it's all of that, and it's probably, in your case, it's the value of the recipe as well in a certain
Exactly,
way.
yeah,
Yeah,
totally. Well, we're
yeah,
gonna
and
take a break, but when we come back, I wanna ask you about how grant makers feel about the total value budgeting process. So
perfect.
today's episode is being brought to you by Pivot Ground, which I created to assist people like you, executive directors, board members, and other nonprofit leaders. I want to help you unleash your full potential to advance the mission that I know you care about so deeply. I like to say that your biggest challenge should be your mission, not funding, not boards, not operations, because those things are so much easier to fix often than achieving your mission. I have been an executive director, a board member, the secret toilet fixer, and now I am a consultant and coach. I know your challenges firsthand, and I want to bring you information, inspiration, and encouragement so that you feel supported to make the greatest impact possible. My gift for you today is a newsletter where you can receive weekly tips for nonprofit leaders like you. You can go to pivotground.com/sign up to access the newsletter. There will also be a link in the show notes. Now I'll get back to my wonderful conversation with Maryn. So, Maryn, you've been a grant maker. Tell
Mhm.
us how grant makers feel about these budgets.
You know, as grant makers, we don't know what we can't see. and a budget that doesn't show us everything it takes to do the nonprofit's work. We understand it that we are seeing everything it takes to do the nonprofit's work. And I think this becomes a repeating cycle is like somehow nonprofits think, well, if the funders won't fund it, then we won't show it. And then we don't show it, and then the funders don't see it, and then they don't fund it. So I think that what I'm talking about is there's a groundswell, and I'm not going to say it's a massive groundswell yet, but what I'm really wanting people to think about in the nonprofit world is being part of that brave conversation that says, no, you really need to see everything it takes. Because my experience is funders can be shocked when they understand that they're only seeing a fraction of what it takes because of the way they structure the budget form in the grant proposal, because of the way they ask the questions. The way they ask the questions is based on what they understand it takes, to make the chocolate chip cookies, but
Right.
they're not seeing the whole picture. And can I give you one great example of how dramatic
Yeah.
the impact can be on that? So a real sore point for nonprofits when it comes to getting funding, particularly in the grants world, is the whole issue of what we now call indirect costs. Used to be called
Mm.
overhead, used to be called, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now it's indirect costs. I'm not sure if it's moving off of that. It's slowly moving off of that, perhaps. But the whole
Do you
idea
have
of
a plug for what you would like it to be called?
I would like it to be called infrastructure costs, please,
I like
because
that.
what we're talking about here are the costs that it costs the costs that it takes the organization to hold everything together, not just to
I
keep
love
the
that.
lights
Yep.
turned on, but it's the core. It's also called core mission costs in a lot of
Mm.
the conversations that are out there right now.
I like that too.
But
I like
there's been
operations, but now that you've said, infrastructure costs, I like it even
yeah.
better. So plus
But when
1.
it used to be called overhead costs, it makes it sound like it's discretionary, it's optional. Oh,
Yeah,
oh, oh,
it's
it's
not.
overhead, it's something over and above what we need. Even
Maybe
indirect
essential.
costs yeah, exactly. Even indirect costs seems to make it sound like it's not part of the actual work that's taking place when
That's
it's
right.
essential to the actual work. So what happens is funders will say, oh, we want to be really careful about the organizations that we support. And if their indirect cost ratio is above a certain level, that means they're not managing their money well. Well, that does
Right.
not mean
Yep.
they're not
No.
managing their money well at all. And there's some wonderful examples about if you went into Subway to order a Subway sandwich and you started questioning about what portion of the thing of the charge for this sandwich is actually paying, for your accounting services. Well, I refuse to pay that. I just want the sandwich, but I don't want to pay for all that fun stuff. While that bigger conversation is going on, we can be shifting the balance between direct and indirect if we are making sure that in our indirect column, we are including all of the contributed value, that we are including the total value of all of our volunteers, of all of the contributed resources as part of our direct cost. And that will automatically bring that indirect ratio down. And again, in my course, I have an example that I show how we plug those same kinds of numbers into that maxillofacial surgeon thing. We can move, in this, again, an extreme example, we can change the indirect cost ratio from literally being 100% of the funding is indirect costs if you're a total volunteer organization, right?
Right?
Right? Is nobody's getting paid anything, so everything is like that. All the way down to something along the level of what did I come up with for 14%, just by how you value your volunteers, just
Yeah.
by how you act, because the direct cost side is going to go up the more accurately you value your volunteers, which means the indirect side is going to go down. And it's automatically going to give us all a more favorable indirect and a more accurate indirect cost ratio as well.
Yeah, I
So,
love
yeah.
how so much of what you're saying to me, I think I love the concept of, it comes from Kanban. Have you ever heard Kanban boards? But the
Oh,
concept of
yes.
Kanban is make it seen. And I
Yes,
love
thank
that
you.
concept. Like,
Yeah.
if we can make it seen, if we can make the problem seen, if we can make the nature of what's really going on in a complex system seen, we are empowered to do stuff around it. And so much of what you're talking about is really resonating with me in this make it seen concept for the funders, for you as a nonprofit leader. And potentially, I mean, you started to touch on, right? There is a bigger sector conversation that needs to be going on or that is going
Absolutely.
on.
It
And that,
is going on.
Mhm.
And there's one other twist what you can do with the indirect cost is, and my grant making is in the university sector where universities have managed to come up with an indirect cost ratio of like 60% because they want to cover their research and all of that. Well, the federal dollars that I was working with would cap out at about 8%. So that leaves a big gap between the actual indirect costs and what a given funder would fund. Happens all of the
Yeah.
time. Well, the difference between the two becomes part of your match. It's just
Mhm.
part of what you're contributing. If you're not recapturing those indirect costs because the funder won't go above a certain level or anything at all, then those dollars, which are part of the value of your budget, will show up on the budget in the match column. Okay, we're contributing that as part of our
Yeah.
match. So
Yeah. Love it.
what the whole idea is, you say, is to show it belongs somewhere. And it's either going to be in the side where you're asking for the funders to support it or the side where you're showing it's a contributed value.
Yeah, I love it. Well, this has been such a valuable conversation about
There you go.
valuable total value budgeting. And I didn't even
Yeah.
intend that pun. Um, what are any last thoughts you would like to leave people with? Or if they're going, yeah, I want to do that, how can they get more information to work with you and learn the
Oh my
details of it?
gosh. Yeah, well, I hope you will all come visit us at Grants Magic U. That's u.grantsmagic.org. All I do all day, every day there is just teach and share. And it's always from the perspective of wearing the grant maker's cap, also with many years as the grant seeker as well. In fact, I think you're going to drop the link in. We've got a live session coming up on May 16th, which I just decided I want to do something live because I'm doing a lot of video things and live on video. It is the total value budget framework in a setting that will give us lots of opportunity not only to talk everything through and show you exactly how to apply the kinds of things that Sarah and I have been talking about here, but lots of room for Q&A at the end so that we can be tackling your what about questions. And there are always tons of what about this, what about that, what about
Sure, I'm
everything else.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
all of those links will be in the show notes.
Perfect.
Thank you so much, Maryn. It's really a pleasure to have you here. And thank you out there for listening, but also for all that you do to make our communities better. Take care of yourself, take time for self care, total up that total value, and be sure to subscribe and listen to the next episode of Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. Until then, all the best.
You've been listening to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. Thanks so much for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode or the bonus episodes. And while you're at it, please leave a rating and review and be sure to share with your friends and colleagues. Tune in every week for more useful insights and wisdom on nonprofit leadership. Thanks so much for all you do for the communities you serve. Until next time, all the best.